Hi, and welcome everyone to this Electric Marronage event. It's one of our Solidarity Speakers events that we started over a year ago. We're so excited to present Solidarities Anarchy. This is going to be a forum regarding questions, practices, and frictions within and across anarchist histories and movements from the perspective of Black, Indigenous, and Puerto Rican anarchist politics and movements. Today, we are so thankful to welcome three speakers, which I'll introduce shortly. Please, yes, let us know where we are, where you're joining us from. My name is Jomaira Figueroa Vasquez, and I am one of the creators and curators of Electric Marronage, which I run with Jessica Marie Johnson at Hopkins, as well as a series of our electricians that spread from Michigan State to Hopkins. I am zooming in today from Ithaca, New York, which is on the traditional Cayuga and Haudenosaunee homelands. And my home institution, Michigan State University, that allows this Zoom to be possible is actually on Three Fires Confederacy land, Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi lands. The university is the first, what they call the pioneer land grant institution. And at the building of MSU, there were Indigenous encampments and communities all along what is now the central of the campus. I think it's important for us to bear witness to these overlapping histories of dispossession and the kinds of fruitful, robust, and radical politics that can come out of seeing one another across the series of differences, racialized, colonized, and others. And so today I want to kind of get started with introducing some of our panelists. We are going to be hearing from each one of our esteemed speakers for about 10 minutes, and then we can, for 10 minutes each, and then we're gonna engage in some Q&A, and we would really love for you to, use the chat function as well as the Q&A function to drop your questions, remarks, comments for these folks. This is a rare occasion to be able to bring in people who are working on anarchy across a series of different rooted politics together to have this conversation. So I really hope that we take the opportunity to listen in, learn something new, or to refresh ourselves on this topic, particularly in our political moment. So I'm going to start introducing folks in the order that they're going to be speaking. First, I want to introduce Teresa Warburton, who lives on Lummi, Nooksack, and Coast Salish territories in Bellingham, Washington. She's the author of Other Worlds Here, Honoring Native Women's Writing in Contemporary Anarchist Movements, which was published by Northwestern University Press in 2020. She is also the co-editor, along with Cowlitz writer Alyssa Washuta, of of the book Shapes of Native Nonfiction, Collected Essays by Contemporary Writers, published by the University of Washington Press in 2019. She teaches English and Women's and Gender Studies and Sexuality Studies at Western Washington University. Her writing has appeared in Students in American Indian Literature, Cultural Studies, Critical Methodologies, Upping the Ante, Anarchist Developments in Cultural Studies, and Perspectives on Anarchist Theory, where she is also a member of the editorial collection. I'm going to actually turn on the transcription mode in case anyone needs that. And then next we have Jorel Melendez Badillo, who is an assistant professor of history at Dartmouth College. His work focuses on the global circulation of radical ideas from the perspective of working class intellectual communities in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean and Latin America. His most recent publication includes The Letter Barriada, Workers, Archival Power, and the Politics of Knowledge in Puerto Rico from Duke University Press, and Páginas Libres, Breve Antología del Pensamiento Anarquista Puertorriqueño, 1900 to 1919, which is published by Editora Educación Emergente in Puerto Rico. He is also working on a book titled Puerto Rico, A National History, under contract with Princeton University Press. And last I saw, that was drafted almost fully, right? And then last but not least, we have William C. Anderson, who is a writer and activist from Birmingham, Alabama, with some family roots in Michigan. His work has appeared in The Guardian, MTV, Truth Out, the British Journal of Photography, and Pitchfork, among others. He is the author of The Nation on No Map, published by AK Press in 2021, and the co-author of As Black as Resistance, also from AK Press in 2018. He is also the co-founder of Offshoot Journal and provides creative direction as the producer of the Black Autonomy podcast. His writings have been included in the anthologies Who Do You Serve, Who Do You Protect by Haymarket in 2016, and No Selves to Defend by Mariam Kaba in 2014. We're gonna be dropping links to all of these books in the chat throughout the talk, so please keep an eye out on that. And so what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna get started right now with Teresa, who will be opening up the conversation with us. And so I'm gonna spotlight you, and then we'll go from there.
Ooh, a spotlight.
Yeah.
How exciting. Well, thank you everyone for being here. And thank you so much to Yarmira and Amanda and Stephanie for doing all the behind the scenes stuff. I know that it takes a lot to make an event like this run, and I really appreciate it. And I also wanted to take a minute to thank Kehalani Kawanui, who couldn't be here with us today, but who brought me and Jorel and William together for the first time a couple of years ago, and is just an influential thinker in, I think, in anarchism right now. And so I just wanted to bring her into this space and be thinking about her. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my book that Yarmira mentioned, Other Worlds Here, and how it relates to the topic of solidarities. And that it's been such a generative way to think about sort of new questions about my work, to think about it in terms of solidarities in the plural. And so I'm really excited to think through some of that today. And because of that, I thought that what I do is talk about some of the solidarities that my work tries to illuminate, while also thinking about how solidarity as a concept is constructed on this broader scale in my work also. And the best way I could think of to start doing this, sort of the only way I could start to think about where those through lines exist in the project, was to go back to the beginning. So I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about how I came to this project in the first place. So when I started graduate school, my work looked very different than it does now. I'm sure that that's the case for a lot of people. I think as we learn and grow, our work changes, and that's good. But for me, the story of how this happened actually really became central to the overall argument that I was trying to make in the book itself. So as I began graduate school, I wanted to focus my work on gendered violence within radical left communities, especially anarchist ones that were explicitly anti-state. So I was really interested in why and how gendered violence was perpetuated in spaces where its rejection was supposedly this sort of core feature of the milieu. And of course, the response that I often got when I posed this question was that these communities exist within social and political worlds from which they can't be automatically separated, even if they have this additional ideological commitment. So essentially, the answer was that the pervasiveness of gendered violence was pervading radical communities, and that was not surprising. But that answer never really sat well with me. And so I went into graduate school feeling like I needed a different answer to this question, because that answer seemed like a really easy out. It was one that I didn't feel like accounted for why gendered violence was perpetuated in spaces that seemingly had this really staunch eye for it. And it didn't really account for the question that I was really interested in, which was how gendered violence became remade within radical communities in ways that were different from its treatment in mainstream society. So when I started, some of my questions were things like, how might people use anti-state and anti-police commitments of their comrades to evade any accountability for gendered violence? How did the threat of infiltration or the importance of effective relationships affect the treatment of claims of gendered violence in radical spaces? That was some of the things that I was interested in. And during those first couple of years of graduate school, I became really trained to talk about my work in that little sort of elevator speech, which we're probably all familiar with, giving that quick little rundown of your scholarship. And I got really used to sort of going around the seminar table and everybody giving their short description of their scholarship. And one day I was doing that sort of honestly nonchalantly, because I'd done it so many times, talking about the work of activists and organizers who had been fighting against gendered violence in radical communities, and where I saw an affinity with that work as an anarchist. And I was in a class with Onondaga scholar Teresa McCarthy, and the class was called Indigenous Knowledge and Methodologies. And when I got done giving this one sort of rundown of my work, in what was a moment of pure generosity, I think, to this anarchist who had just gone on and on about gendered violence in her communities, she pushed back on me a little bit and asked, what does it mean to do that work on Native land? And I think that ever since then, I've been trying to answer that question, or maybe a better way of putting it is that that question has animated my work ever since. I think it's one that ended up forming the sort of structural foundation of the work that I do. So in time, thinking about my role as a settler anarchist and thinking about what that meant in doing this work about gendered violence, I became really interested in similar questions about anarchist communities, but this time with an eye towards the connectedness of settler colonialism to the other structures of domination like gendered violence that I saw reproduced in some anarchist spaces. And so I became really interested in how the structure of settlement gets reproduced in some of these spaces, not simply through a sort of inheritance of settler logics, but by remaking settler structures within anarchist logic. So in thinking about the concept of solidarities, I've realized that a lot of what I was trying to do with this argument was to understand how settlement had upended certain possible solidarities, certain points of connection that would bolster the broader arguments against capitalism and the state, which obviously are central to anarchist thought and practice. So I go in the book, I explore some of those solidarities more deeply, but I thought I'd sketch out a couple examples here just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So for instance, one of the things I became really interested in, and there is a chapter in the book, is the story of the 1999 protest against the meetings of the World Trade Organization and how the story about those protests circulated in books about the rise of 21st century anarchism. So this event, sometimes called the Battle in Seattle, looms, well, most often called the Battle in Seattle, looms really large in the story of this era of anarchism. So if you've ever read a book about 21st century anarchism, this story is probably in there, probably at the beginning. It's ubiquitously invoked as a type of origin story or birth story kind of. And I think that this makes a lot of sense. It's a great story. It's a triumphant story. It's one that highlights the possibilities of coalitions and of creativity, of radical affinity, of direct action, and of course, of solidarity. And I think that that's something that we want to hold on to right now, especially we need stories like that as part of the movement to remember that there are times that we win. But the ubiquity of the battle in Seattle also eclipses the first Battle of Seattle, the one that happened in 1856. And so this battle appears very little in any discussions of the 1999 protests, even though it shares the same name. And this earlier Battle of Seattle is often narrated as an attack by Native people on settlers in Seattle during the time that it was part of Washington Territory. So this one day of conflict, for people who aren't aware, was part of this broader history called the Puget Sound War. And in that way, it was really this turning point in the settlement of Seattle and the establishment of Seattle as a settler city. And as Cole Thrush has argued, this battle of 1856 remains enshrined in local mythology as the sort of travail of early Seattle. So the way he talks about it, the commemoration of this battle throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries marks this sort of inverse of the Chief Seattle speech, where it sort of narrates this history where blameless white pioneers earn honor and success by surviving threats from nature, from Native people associated with nature, or a corrupt government. And in doing so, this story of the Battle of Seattle functions as a justification for settlement. So in the Seattle region, this battle is commemorated and memorialized in all kinds of ways, just showing the continued importance of narrating the story in a certain way. There are high schools named after the events. There are plaques around the city of Seattle commemorating the events. So it's a really interesting way that that story gets retold. But what I was really interested in was why we weren't telling these two stories together. And what do we lose when the stories of these two battles in Seattle aren't told together, especially in anarchist spaces? And as I was thinking about it for this talk, I think that it has something to do with solidarities. I think it prevents us from seeing the connection between the settlement of Seattle and its eventual importance as a hub of global trade in what some still call the most trade-dependent region in the country. And it prevents us from understanding the connection between like the U.S. armed support of settlers in the 1856 battle and the choice to have the meetings of the largest supranational trade organization in Seattle in 1999. So I think what we essentially lose is the thread of how settlement and globalization are related. We lose that thread of solidarity that could connect these stories over time. So when the structures of settlement are reproduced using anarchist logics, I think we also lose the thread of solidarity that can connect important stories over space as well. So in the battles of Seattle, I look at these two events that are related, but are not contemporaneous. They're really historically, well, far apart to me, 100 years, but 150 years. But I also look at some events that are contemporaneous, but happening across a wide swath of space. So in my book, I also look to another important moment in anarchist history, which is Haymarket. So much like the 1999 battle in Seattle, the 1886 Haymarket affair really looms large in the history of anarchism in the United States. And it really remains a really pivotal part of the history of anarchism at the turn of the 20th century. But of course, this late 19th century was also a pivotal moment in the solidification of US empire, rooted in these simultaneous projects of closing the colonial frontier and extending the reach of US empire into the Pacific and Caribbean. And so in the same year that the 4 Haymarket martyrs were executed, the Dawes Act ushered in assimilation and allotment era of the US federal Indian policy. And then 3 years later, the Wounded Knee Massacre occurred in Lakota territory. And so I just want to bring these into conversation to think about what happens when we think about the fact that Haymarket and the Dawes Act happened in the same year. And of course, this process of violently appropriating native land on the continent can't be considered apart from the US occupation of territory off the continent as well. So within 15 years of Haymarket, the US had also occupied numerous sovereign nations following the 1898 Treaty of Paris. And obviously that included Cuba and the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. That same year in the Pacific, the US officially annexed the Kingdom of Hawaii. And a year later, they signed the Tripartite Convention with Germany, partitioning Samoa. So there's just all of these things that are happening contemporaneously that aren't really discussed within the context of Haymarket, nor is Haymarket often put within the context of this larger story of settlement and empire. So because of this, contemporary anarchists have sort of we've been unable to make these important connections between the quelling of radical transnational labor movements, the appropriation of large swaths of native territory, and the expansion of US empire in the late 19th century. So again, I think we lose the thread on those connections of resistance between the US state in Chicago and Hawaii, for instance, and we lose the thread on those solidarities. So in this book project, I argue that one way to regain these threads or to see them sort of more clearly is through the work of Native women writers. I look at memoir and poetry and fiction, and I'm interested in how contemporary Native women writers have used literature to make arguments about precisely this question of solidarities, or as I understand it, of good relations. So all of this, what I've said today, and I think the book and my work more broadly, is essentially about good relations. How do we have them? What do they look like? Where do they happen? What does it mean to be in relation to each other, with the land, with its people? What does it look like now? What could it look like in the future? But also, what does it look like in the past? And what kinds of practices have existed and continue to exist that put us in good relation to each other? And so a lot of what I do is just thinking about how can we honor those kinds of solidarities today in ways that they've existed in the past and that we want them to continue existing into the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. That was wonderful. Next, we have Jorel.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me well? Super. Super, super. So I'll just jump right into my presentation. So before I start, I just wanted to echo what Teresa was mentioning, bringing Kehaulani into this space. And I just wanted to say thank you to Teresa for those words about Kehaulani. And also I wanted to send Kehaulani our love and solidarity. We were talking before the event started that Kehaulani, as Teresa was mentioning, was the person that brought us together. And so I just also wanted to echo Teresa on that. So I'm speaking to you from the Nakina, the unceded homeland of the Abenaki and Wabanaki peoples, and I acknowledge and honor the land and waterways that have been stewarded by the Alnowak. I'm also a diasporic subject from the archipelago of Puerto Rican, currently colonized and occupied by the United States Empire. Before I begin, I also want to thank Jomaira Figueroa and Electric Marronage for the invitation. Also Amanda Papley for all her work, and Stephanie Bravo for all the work behind the scenes. It's such an honor and a privilege to be in community with Teresa and William, folks that I deeply admire and respect. And so I would like to use my time today to talk about two of my recent publications. The first is Páginas Libres, Breve Antología del Pensamiento Anarquista en Puerto Rico from 1900 to 1919, this book over here. And it was recently published by Editora Educación Emergente, a radical and feminist academic press in the western side of Puerto Rico. And I mentioned its location in the western side because often the geopolitics of knowledge make San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico, as the hub for intellectual production. And I just wanted to mention that the book could be bought directly through their website, but there's also a free PDF open access version available through Editora Educación Emergente's website. So Páginas Libres, the name, it's a tribute to Juan Vilar, a Black anarchist from the town of Caguas, who published a book by the same name in early 20th century Puerto Rico. Vilar was a cigar maker that founded the first anarchist organization in Puerto Rico called Solidarity in 1905. He was also a self-taught intellectual that published newspaper articles and at least 4 different books at the beginning of the 20th century. Unfortunately, only one of his books has survived, and that book is Páginas Libres. Vilar died as a martyr on May 1st, 1915, echoing what Teresa was talking about, the mythology of Haymarket, right? So he died on May 1st, 1915, but he died because of an illness. He died poor and he died forgotten. And I'll say a few words about how that process of erasure took place. The anthology, Páginas Libres, took me almost a decade to complete it. It was imagined as a companion for my first book, Voces Libertarias, published in 2013. Both Voces Libertarias and Páginas Libres stem from my own personal and political experiences. They were the product of an ethos of do-it-yourself or DIY that I learned in the punk community. Since I could not find anarchists in Puerto Rican historiography, I decided to look for them myself. At that moment when I was trying to write that first book, I was also organizing with several compañeras and compañeros. In 2009, I used to publish a small zine called No Pasarán. I was part of an organization called Acción Libertaria. And later in 2010, 2011, I joined a group of friends and comrades in organizing a conference for the North American Anarchist Studies Network, which ended up becoming a book I co-edited with Nathan Jun called Without Borders or Limits, an Interdisciplinary Approach to Anarchist Studies. But most importantly, at the closing of that conference, in the plenary that closed the conference, a question took hold of the conversation: what now? So a group of us decided to open a social studies center in Santurce, Puerto Rico, which was called El Centro Social CCC. So Voces Libertarias, which was a history of anarchism in Puerto Rico, stemmed from the conversations that happened within that space. So although I wrote the book, it was part of broader conversations. And so in those conversations, we wanted to know what our ancestors and predecessors had done in relation to anarchism in Puerto Rico. We wanted to engage in a transhistorical dialogue with them. And someone in the collective, Eduardo Rosario, used to say that history often felt like a state of siege, un estado de sitio, where you could only speak to certain individuals. Anarchists were those silenced and out of reach, people that we could not be in conversation or in community transhistorically. It was a problem of archival power, as I would later find out. Páginas Libres also stemmed from that initial research for Voces Libertarias. The books that are part of the anthology were the books that I found while writing about the history of anarchism in Puerto Rico. The anthology includes books by anarchists Ángel María Diepa, Juan Vilar, Venancio Cruz, and Juan José López. It also includes previously untapped newspaper articles written by the anarcho-feminist Luisa Capetillo, which she published in the Anarchist Press. And I have a beautiful plushie of Luisa Capetillo, the Puerto Rican anarcho-feminist that I always love to show when I talk about her. So besides Capetillo and Juan Vilar, we do not know much about these authors. Again, they were erased from the archive, and I'll mention a few things about that in a second. So the idea of the anthology was to make these books available so they could freely circulate once again as their authors had wanted to. But life got in the way, and that was put in the back burner until the summer of 2019. That summer, the Puerto Rican people ousted Governor Ricardo Rosselló through weeks of protests, strikes, and militant actions. It was then in 2019 that I felt the necessity of such anthology. Anarchism was resurging in Puerto Rico, at least publicly, because anarchists have always been there operating in the undercommons. Thus, I see the anthology as a way to engage in transhistorical dialogue with folks that were actively and forcefully excluded from history. I see it as a tool of study to imagine a future otherwise, a decolonial future in Puerto Rico. I also wrote these books to honor my family. I come from a working class background, and I was raised by my grandparents who come from a family that worked in the sugarcane fields and cigar workshops. I grew up listening to stories about their struggles and hardships. Thus, I strive to write working class histories to honor where I come from. But as I continued to write history and studying history, I saw that my family members were absent even from those stories that were written from quote unquote below. That is why I wrote The Letter Barriada, which is this other book right here. So in The Letter Barriada, I explore the ways that a handful of working class intellectuals produced knowledges in the margins of the country's cultural elite at the turn of the 20th century. As the United States occupied the archipelago in 1898, Puerto Rico's polity was transformed and working class intellectuals fought to carve a space within it. They used print media, social rituals, and political organizing to create an intellectual community that I've called the lettered barriada. This community was not limited to Puerto Rico, however. Participating in labor rituals like May Day or reading and writing in the international labor press allowed workers to imagine themselves as part of a global working class community without having to leave their neighborhoods. But carefully exploring that intellectual community also allowed me to see the way that a handful of male, urban, skilled workers also created a set of hierarchies in the margins that forcefully produced silences that erased peoples from the working class archives they were creating. The book then is also an exploration about the politics of knowledge and archival production in the margins. It shows how participating in that transnational community allowed workers to exclude folks locally. That handful of workers that I study and follow in the book not only sought to take the means of production in a classic Marxist sense, but they also sought to dominate the means of working class knowledge production. They also saw themselves as the self-assigned interlocutors of the laboring masses and did not challenge the elite Eurocentric, patriarchal, and anti-Black discourses. But in fact, working class intellectuals often reproduced those logics in their writings. The idealized worker that they crafted in their discourses was always male and always white. Ultimately, in that book, In the Letter Barriada, I try to explore the ways that power operates in historical production transhistorically. The narratives that these workers produce at the beginning of the 20th century still carry enormous power today. They still actively shape our understanding of the past because they dictated who was important enough to be considered part of their archives, later used by radical historians in the 1970s to write their histories from below. But to conclude, and to bring these books in dialogue together, I'd like to finish once again by invoking Juan Vilar. I think that he's a fascinating case that allows us to concretely see how this silence operated. Juan Vilar was a member of the Federación Libre de Trabajadores, the Free Workers Federation, an organization that dominated the world of labor at the beginning of the 20th century, and thus dominated the production of working class narratives. The Federación Libre, however, became a colonial hub of the American Federation of Labor in 1902. The AFL had a strong anti-radical sentiment and sought to de-radicalize their unions. In 1911, for example, the Puerto Rican state cracked down on anarchist social study centers in Caguas and Bayamón after a failed strike led to a worker to kill his boss. Juan Vilar was part of that group and was arrested and spent 2 years in prison. He spent most of his time in prison in the infirmary because he was ill, probably from tuberculosis, a common illness among cigar makers. Back then, he wrote a series of letters to the Federación Libre demanding an explanation of why he was abandoned by the union when he needed it the most. Thus, he died, as I mentioned earlier, in poverty. Juan Vilar was also erased from official labor narratives written by early 20th century working class intellectuals because he was an anarchist at a moment when the Federación Libre sought to de-radicalize its unions due to their collaboration with the American Federation of Labor. But as I show in the book, he was also silenced because he was Black at a moment when the Federación Libres sought to silence any discourse around race. Those exclusions and silences were produced in early 20th century Puerto Rico, but still shape what we know, who we know, and how we understand history in the present. And so I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the Q&A later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jorel. I just want to thank everyone for participating in the chat. The Q&A's forum is coming in, so please keep putting your questions in the Q&A. And last but not least, we have William C. Anderson, who I am going to spotlight right now. Please take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. Those were really wonderful presentations, and I'm excited to talk about the ways that our work intersects, because I heard so many really vivid connections between the things I'm working on and what's been talked about so far. I also want to give a shout out to Keilani and send love and thoughts for bringing us all together. And yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and get right into it. I'm gonna talk about a lot of different things today with regard to my work. And, you know, bear with me as I kind of jump all over the place. So one of the first things that I wanted to talk about is kind of how I came into this. And I started thinking about anarchism because of questions of citizenship and nation and place that I encountered in struggle. I come from organizing activist background in Birmingham, Alabama. That's my hometown. And during the time that I first started organizing, I was encountering a lot of different problems in left spaces. I kind of moved around different left spaces, kind of looking for a place and looking for an ideological home, I guess you could say. And so along that journey, I would say that I became pretty frustrated around the time that I started exploring anarchism. I became frustrated with a lot of the ways that I felt that the spaces that I had been in, which were primarily statist spaces, the way that they weren't answering some of the questions that I had about my place in the world. So I became interested in anarchism initially and started looking into classical anarchism first and foremost, because that was the anarchism I had always heard about. But, admittedly, I had never really gotten along with anarchists. I'd always thought anarchism was a white ideology. I'd always thought that it was, the things that we hear stereotypically, the misreadings, that it was chaos and that it was about, just creating a sort of terroristic kind of, violence in the world to reject any and all governance and organization. So I didn't actually really encounter Black anarchism until I came across the work of those like Ashanti Alston and Lorenzo Kamboa Irvin. And when I did actually come across Lorenzo Kamboa Irvin's work, it was because I met him in person at an organizing workshop that I was co-leading with a friend. And so when that happened, Lorenzo's work really kind of threw my whole world into crisis in terms of what I thought and the way that I related to the left and what I had internalized thus far. Because Lorenzo's work was doing something that actually challenged the entirety of the left, in my opinion. So when that happened, it kind of set me on a journey, which leads me to where I am today. And I have gone through many different phases in relation to this work, as Teresa brought up. You change and you grow and you learn. At least that's what's supposed to happen. But initially, one of the first big events that happened along the way was I co-authored the essay, The Anarchism of Blackness, with Zoe Samudzu. And when we were writing this essay together, we were coming into a place where we were trying to address how the experiences and the lives of Black people in the Americas could speak to an anarchist politic because of the things that Black people encounter, being rejected from nation, being rejected from citizenship, and being rejected based on Blackness. So that sort of idea that we were working with was something that wasn't new, but we were putting our own voices forward in that particular moment because of everything that was happening along the lines of the rise of this neo-fascism that we're seeing today, and everything that was happening with regard to the Trump presidency and the building reactionary conservatism that we are seeing in this country today. And so after that, we then went forward to write As Black as Resistance. And when we were writing As Black as Resistance, we were coming into another place where we were expanding those ideas and talking about a kind of a wider manifesto that could speak to Black struggle and anarchism with regard to what our movements needed and what that particular moment could mean for forming a real political opposition in this country, a real left opposition to everything that we were fighting against in terms of state violence and US imperialism and so on and so forth. And now I've come along to write The Nation on No Map. And The Nation on No Map is, again, another connection to the work that I've been doing prior. But I'm actually taking a bit more of, I guess, a dramatic turn here with this most recent book, because I think that with all of the previous work and the history that I'm talking about that I encountered, I started asking a lot more questions about everything, including anarchism in and of itself, not just in the classical sense, but all of it, and the relationship that I have to ideology in the first place. And Jorel, I appreciate what you said about actually, having this be informed by personal experiences and having to go look for those figures that inspire you, because I've now gotten to a place where I'm looking very clearly at and closely at Black history to try to find people and places and events that speak to this larger critique that I'm trying to make in The Nation on No Map. So what The Nation on No Map is really about, it's, at a very basic level, it's about Black anarchism and abolition. But I am actually trying to talk about how Black anarchism can actually be helpful for activists, for organizers, for people in general, artists, whoever needs it. It can be helpful for us to have a lens to see a particular place on the left where people have come and they have done something that actually transcends the entirety of the left. There is a critique of classical anarchism within Black anarchism. There's a critique of various Marxisms within Black anarchism. There's a critique of nationalism within Black anarchism. It draws from the histories that precede it, because those who were the founding thinkers in Black anarchism, Kwesi Balagoon, Lorenzo Kamboa Irvin, Martin Sostre, Ashanti Alston, Ojore Lutelo, these are people who actually wrote and drew from the things that inspired them and the things that formed them, the experiences they had in the civil rights movement, the experiences they had in the Black Power movement, and the experience that they would have following their breakaway from those movements and their critiques of those movements. They took what actually inspired them and what informed their politics, and then they actually developed new thought and new theory. They didn't actually attach themselves to a sort of rigid dogma and orthodoxy that limited them. And so I'm trying to take my experiences and my thinking and my writing so far and use that Black anarchist lens that I'm talking about in this text to try to encourage anyone who's willing to think with me or who might be thinking something similar to actually push us towards something greater than the limitations of a lot of the radicalism and the leftism that we know right now. Because so much of it across the board actually holds us in place when we're actually supposed to be transcending and working towards something greater. So rather than getting attached to, kind of this overzealous relationship to any sort of ideology or any sort of politic, I'm asking, what can we learn from Black anarchism to inform this particular moment where we're seeing conversations about abolition become more popular than we've ever seen them in our lifetimes? So what I'm writing about now, I'm looking at these different histories. I'm trying to pull from these histories and give them more recognition and more writing and more thought, where it's certainly deserved. One of the things I've been working on is the Martin Sostre Institute with Garrett Felber, who is writing Martin Sostre's biography. That's just one example. We're trying to highlight the life of Martin Sostre because of, again, what you were speaking to, Jorel, about having to excavate these people and ask, why is it that this person is so overlooked? Martin Sostre is the person who introduced Lorenzo Camboa Irvin to anarchism in prison. They were both political prisoners. And Martin Sostre at the time was actually a world famous political prisoner. And here he is at the foundation of Black anarchism because he introduces Lorenzo, and Lorenzo goes on to write Anarchism and the Black Revolution, which is, the foundational text of Black anarchism. And you have to ask, when you look at the history, you look and you see people like Angela Davis and Sartre speaking about Martin Sostre. You see that there was all of this wide international news coverage of his case. You have to ask how somebody like him gets lost to history, and what does that mean? And what does it mean more largely for these Black anarchists to have had their stories become so minimal in the larger conversation about anarchism? And what does it mean for this history to become increasingly relevant now? So that's what I'm working on. But in addition to that, I'm also trying to speak to the experiences of Black people who go unnamed in different ways because of their stories being overlooked and being neglected. I recently wrote an essay about Lovett Fort Whiteman, who was one of the first, if not the first, Black communist in the US. And his story of just the amazing contributions he made to the development of Black labor organizing and communist organizing in this country. And he ends up going to the Soviet Union and spending a lot of time there, going back and forth, trying to organize on behalf of the Soviets. And then he actually starts asking a lot of questions around race and around place. And he ends up alienating himself to an extent that he gets swept up in the purges and dies through forced labor in the Gulag. So that's just another example that I'm trying to tie into this string of work that I'm doing, which is asking questions about Blackness, about race, about nation, about identity and citizenship that I think anarchism speaks to in multiple ways and helps us answer, especially Black anarchism, because of the ways that Black anarchism has had to struggle within the anarchist movement just for recognition and just for acceptance, despite a lot of pushback. So I'm happy to really kind of dive into this with y'all today, and that's just kind of generally what I'm writing about. So yeah.
Thank you so much, William, for that. And thank you all. I'm gonna spotlight everybody here. All right. At a spotlight. I'll turn on my camera, but I'm not gonna spotlight myself. I'll just be over here in the ether. I want to thank you so much for sharing both your work, your written work and your organizing work, and for being open about your politics in this forum, in this conversation. And there's so much fantastic conversation in the chat and some Q&A. I wanted to ask y'all some questions, and perhaps they dovetail with some of the things in the Q&A, but then I'll turn and focus to the Q&A in a second. But there's so many moments of confluence between all of the work that you're doing. And I think that it really bodes well for thinking about solidarities across these different racialized identities and different forms of colonialism and ongoing forms of oppression and dispossession. I wanted to ask, I was originally gonna ask like, 2 questions for everyone, but I kind of have like crafted individual questions that folks can jump in on. So I wanted to ask Teresa to talk to us a little bit about an example of these Native women's writing that you were talking about, particularly when speaking about good relations or solidarity, right? And I think it dovetails with one of the questions in the chat, which asked, Teresa, can you say more about how you define good relations in your book and how you came to that definition? But you gave us kind of the scaffolding for the project, and I would love for you to share maybe one example from the book of the literature, Native women's literature, that helps us kind of understand and fleshes out so much of the history that you foregrounded for us.
Yeah, thanks, Yomira. That's to say, but I'll try to keep it. I'll try to keep it brief. I think one of the ways that I just understand good relations is through my training with Haudenosaunee intellectuals, and that being a really central part of Haudenosaunee cosmology, and that we need to be in relations with each other that enable the continued existence of all of us and the earth, and thinking about how do we have those relationships in good ways. And so I was thinking about, well, when I'm thinking about this question, I think about the structure of my book. The book is divided into, it sounds like a lot, but it's 6 chapters, but it's because there's like 3 units that each one has a chapter that's sort of about what's a particular issue in contemporary anarchism that comes out of its sort of association with settlement or its failure to sort of address settlement. And then each one has a chapter about what Native women's texts can we look at to sort of address this particular issue. So in the chapter where I talk about the battles of Seattle, the books that I look at in that 2nd chapter is Alyssa Washuta's book, My Body is a Book of Rules, and Deborah Miranda's book, Bad Indians, both of which are memoirs that operate in a really interesting formal capacity. Like they use a lot of different forms in the books. They're not sort of traditional memoirs. Like Alyssa's book uses annotated bibliographies and annotated doctor's notes and stuff like that. And then Deborah Miranda's book is based on the mission project that a lot of 4th graders have to do in California about the California missions. And so she's like doing her own sort of mission project. And I think that both of those books, for me, one of the things that highlighted good relations was the way that they talked about Native women's bodies and their own bodies. And in the book, I talk about how they use that, their understandings of their own bodies and its relationship to history to navigate through the past, present, and future as individuals, but also as members of their community. So I talk about this sort of body as compass or body as navigation that I think happens in each of their pieces that allows for this different way of relating to history and the future in ways that really make it so that they aren't in sort of conflict, but that there's places where Native women's bodies exist as this thing unto themselves instead of always a site of violence. Yeah, and that's one of the ways that they are talking about good relationships with each other, with parents, with other people, sort of across trauma. And I think that that's a powerful way to think about the purpose of anarchism, is to think about how does it affect how we relate to each other and to the land.
Thank you so much for that. I have a question for Jorel, and it is about the kind of the way that you're conceptualizing the politics of knowledge and archival production. You ended with a really great example of something that was, a set of knowledge and a figure that's left out. But I was wondering if you could offer us an example of knowledges or people that were marginalized, perhaps women or Afro-Puerto Rican subjects within these movements. So yes.
Awesome. Thank you, Yomira, for that question. Absolutely. So in terms of the politics of knowledge and archival power, one of the things that I really wanted to do in the letter Barriada was to think of workers as intellectuals because they saw themselves as intellectuals. Oftentimes in that historiographical turn, particularly driven by social history from the 1970s onwards, there was this romanticization of the worker as this revolutionary subject, and that's it. Everyone was proud of their worker identity. But when I was looking at these folks, they saw themselves as poets. They saw themselves as essayists. They saw themselves as journalists. And so I was taking that seriously. So I was looking at them as intellectuals. And I think one of the arguments that I'm making in the book is that they understood the power in crafting a historical narrative. And if we think of historical narratives in terms of Michel Hoff-Trouillot's concept of in silencing the past, he argues that silences are actively produced and that any historical narrative is a bundle of silences. So they knew the power that excluding people from the narrative had. And so one of the arguments that I'm making is that although those were subtle erasures that happened in early 20th century, they still carry power today in terms of who we know and in terms of crafting what we know about history. Martin Sostre, for example, it blows my mind. I wrote to Lorenzo when we were starting that social studies center in 2010, and he told me that story of how he met Martin Sostre in prison and how he was an Afro-Boricua. And he was like, you should name your centro Martin Sostre. And I was like, mind blown, right? But we don't know anything about Martin Sostre because the Archive of Puerto Ricanidad has no space for an Afro-Boricua from the diaspora who was in prison, who was an anarchist, right? And so in my book, to give an example about Afro-Boricua women, this woman right here, Juana Colon, was erased from the labor archives because she was Black, illiterate, and she was a woman at early 20th century Puerto Rico, although she built the Socialist Party in Comerío, and she was a comrade with the founders of the Socialist Party. When those folks wrote a history of Comerío and of the Socialist Party, they simply erased Juana Colon. And so we now have a history of Juana Colon because the people in Comerío, a small town in the mountains in Puerto Rico, remembered Juana Colon. And so they created a sort of street counter archive. And so in the book, I look at the ways that working class intellectuals silence Juana Colon because of her Blackness, because of her positionality as an illiterate socialist organizer. But I'm also thinking about the ways that people in the streets of Comerío remember her. And so there's a school named after her in Comerío, and it's not because she was part of any historical narrative. It's because she was remembered by her community as a pillar. And so the last thing I'll say there is that in the book, I'm trying to see the ways that those silences were created and the power behind historical production, but I didn't want to create a working class canon to include Juana. And one last thing, I think there's something very powerful because although the Socialist Party excluded Juana from the historical narratives, when she died in her last will, and I don't know if she left the will, but her last will was to be covered in the Socialist Party's flag, the same party that excluded her. The same with Juan Vilar. He died in poverty, ignored by the Federación Libre, but he died proud of being part of it, a federation that wrote a historical narrative that had no space for him. And so I'll leave it at that. We can talk some more later on, but I think that for me, I'm very interested in the power behind historical narratives and so how workers in early 20th century understood that and erased people from the archive.
Thank you for that, Jorel. That's a really dynamic connection between Martin Sostre and Juana Colon, especially, you know, as William was talking, I was trying to Google images of Martin Sostre and I was like, este tiene cara de Afro-Boricua, but you know, that's not, it doesn't actually appear, right? Like that doesn't get surfaced. And I think that actually gets to another kind of silencing, right? And it's that friction between Blackness and Puerto Ricanness that we still need to bregar with, right? But that's just such a great connection between those two presentations. And William, I had a question, particularly, and it's going to be a little different than what I thought I was going to ask you, but I was just so compelled by the way that you were talking not only about Black anarchist movements and Black anarchism as radically different in many ways than like white anarchist movements that are have particular kinds of stereotypical associations, right? but also I was really compelled by the question of care and the politics of care that Black anarchism has within it in terms of rescuing, pulling out from obscurity, and taking care of the legacies of Black anarchists in the past and also Black anarchists in the present. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that. I think that's something that is not often thought about when we think about Black anarchist movements.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a bunch of things I want to say about that. One of the first things I'll say is the reason that this work is so important to me. I think that a lot of people when they think of or they see what I'm doing, that they think that I'm trying to diversify the canon and that I'm trying to rescue classical anarchism from its whiteness. And I'm absolutely not trying to do that. I'm not trying to establish new dogma either. I'm not trying to establish new orthodoxy. I'm not trying to say everybody be a Black anarchist. This is the way and the light. That sort of religiosity and that sort of rigidity is one of the things that I actually critique throughout the entirety of the Nation on the Map. That's one of the things that I'm pushing back against in all of its forms, whether it's through liberal reformism, whether it's through classical anarchism, whether it's through different Marxisms, or whether it's through Black nationalism. I'm actually saying that Black anarchism gives an example and shows us praxis about how to overcome and transcend the limitations that come when you have an overzealous religious relationship with ideology and politics. So with regard to the care aspect of this, the reason that it's important to do this work is because you're going to repeat history and you're going to have the worst problems that you've already seen manifest before and historically come back up and arise again if you don't learn from history. And you have to learn from all of history, not just the history that you want to talk about. So if you're not talking about why these certain people are erased, why are these stories highlighted, why isn't this set of politics discussed more broadly, then how are you going to learn the lessons of history in a complete way that helps you transcend and helps you get closer to achieving something liberatory? You can't do that if you're only interested in repeating the same stories that you've always heard and reading the same 10 books that you've always talked about. The person I just brought up, Lovett Fort Whiteman, one of the reasons I wanted to highlight his story, he's not an anarchist. He's not a Black anarchist. He was one of the first Black communists in the US. The reason I bring up his story is because he is a Black man who was the son of an enslaved man from South Carolina. They go to Texas. And then Lovett's life is interesting in the sense that he goes to Tuskegee Institute. He actually spends a lot of time in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. He travels back into the United States and then goes to Russia after the revolution. And the time that he spends there, he's just a party line state communist all the way. He's everything that the Soviet Union is doing at the beginning of the state formation there. He is supporting in every way he can and trying to tie it to the struggles of Black people in the United States. The reason that I bring up his story here is because the relevance is he's going back and forth doing all of this organizing on behalf of the party and on behalf of the Soviet state. He's trying to escape state violence in the US, where he's the son of somebody who's been enslaved and trying to push for something greater. In the Soviet state, he's being monitored by the FBI. And then when he brings up the race question, when he brings up the Negro question with the Soviets, it starts causing a problem to the extent that he becomes so alienated that he starts being monitored by the state, the secret police in the Soviet Union. So I'm trying to tie in this connection here that is saying that there is something that we need to be asking ourselves about the state in general, and Black anarchism can help us answer this question, because he ends up getting killed in this place where he's putting in so much work thinking that he's pushing towards something more liberatory. He ends up getting killed in a way that he could have been killed in the United States. Now, that's not to minimize or conflate the two, but that's to say that this sort of history is important. Because if you look at that history and say, how did this happen? How did one of the first Black communists get killed by this state that is so glorified in radical left history, and we don't talk about it? You can't have a good conversation about these sorts of things oftentimes because people are more interested in glorifying their own history, their own radical history, their own ideological history, and actually asking hard questions about how did this happen? What can we learn from it? What does it tell us about the state? What does it tell us about citizenship? What does it tell us about Blackness? What does it tell us about race and class? So you have a whole history of that within Black anarchism and within the history of Black radicalism more largely, with autonomous formations and radicals of all sorts going all over the world and struggling against state violence everywhere. So I think that the care aspect is really important to help us actually achieve something new rather than just creating a religious relationship to radicalism.
100%. You know, I couldn't help but think about how important it is for our politics not to be fanatical, right? And I'm thinking about this in a relationship, like, I'm like, you know, we could be sports fans about this, you know what I'm saying? And we don't want to hear nothing about the Mets, or we don't want to hear nothing about the Buffalo Bills or whatever, no matter how terrible they are. Sorry for any Bills fans out there. But I mean, to say that, like, we have to be much more nuanced and much more open, right? With understanding the limitations of these politics and the possibilities of them, as well as their histories, what they can and cannot do, right? And how they need to continue to change, right? In the face of our daily lives becomes so important. And I think that's something that Teresa brings up so much in her work as well. So thank you for that. Just super evocative. And I think there's so many ways I'm sitting here like, yeah, okay. So we have a few questions in the Q&A. I'm gonna go through a few of them. So the first one, honestly, this is the question: how y'all looking so cute this morning? I don't know if y'all want to answer that, but just know that you have been complimented at the top of the chat. And so there's a question for William. If you could type in the chat the names of those writers who introduced you to Black anarchism, and maybe to offer or recommend starting like where to start from with those writers. And there's a question for everybody here, which is, can you talk about your research process, how you were able to find and discover these kinds of like street archives, street knowledge, and untold knowledges? And then, I mean, I can ask one more. Let me ask one more or not? Are we good? One more? Okay, so the one that I just saw right now is, for each of the panelists, which anarchist thinkers, either classical or contemporary, have inspired your thinking and your work? So we can start with any of those. Talk about your research process, how you're able to find and discover all these knowledges, these street archives, this work, and then which anarchist thinkers have, classical or contemporary, have inspired your thinking and work.
We're all so shy. Like, no one wants to go. I'll jump in, because we also had a conversation of who was going to present first, and Theresa was the one that said she'll do it. But we were all like, no, we don't want to do it. So I'll jump and try to answer these questions first. So in terms of the research process in radical history, or whenever you're attentive to these sort of silences, there's always this saying about reading against the grain in terms of the archive. I think that we cannot simply read against the grain. We need to read against the archive at times, because the archive excludes. And so for me, when I'm talking about archives, I'm not talking about physical repositories. I'm thinking more of, and I don't want to cite Foucault, but I'll cite Foucault in terms of the archive is the limit of what can be said, right? And so whatever is outside of the archive, it's something that it's difficult to get at. And so for me, it's always a challenge. And, you know, I could talk about in detail about the methodology of how I try to read sources against the grain, but it's also tied to the sorts of questions that I ask these documents. Before, oftentimes the history of anarchism is a history that's relegated to outside of the state. And so oftentimes I could not find anarchists when I was working in El Archivo General de Puerto Rico and the National Archives, right? And so at times it frustrated me, but now I kind of celebrate it because they were eluding the state, because the state was the one producing all this knowledge. And so being in the archive was a way of being, part of, recognized by the state. And so they did not want any recognition. And I think a lot about Marronage and think with our friend Pedro Lebrón, La Filosofía del Marronage, to think about, other ways of producing sort of histories outside of the archive, and how can we get to that? I don't have a clear, set way of looking at archives. So I try to think about how to read the archives against itself. In terms of the street archives, Juana Colón, as I mentioned, it was the people that actually created this kind of archive. So looking at non-traditional sources in terms of history, not simply limiting ourselves to state archives, but also looking at other sorts of oral histories, literature, using your imagination, what could have happened, using different sort of sources. And so in terms of anarchist thinkers, I really like this quote from Saidiya Hartman's latest book, Wayward Lives, in which she's talking about how for these Southern Black girls in New York, the anarchist classics did not offer anything to them. Only a misreading of the anarchist canon would offer anything to these Black women. And so I think that's important. And for me, I'm inspired by Puerto Rican anarchists. And so reading them also humanizes them. And so I arrive at this from this punk ethos of kill your idols. And so I also read them against themselves. And I see how they were also reproducing really messed up, heteropatriarchal, racist, anti-Black discourses as well, right? And so you have someone like Badillo, who I rock with her plushie, but at the same time, she also wrote really problematic things in terms of homosexuality, in terms of masturbation, although she advocated free love and whatnot. So for me, I don't have a canon, but I'm inspired by multiple anarchists, particularly Puerto Rican anarchists, but with the caveat that I also have to read them against themselves at times.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I can go next. I think that my process is, I write mostly about contemporary Native literature, and there's just so much out there. Like it's just a very different sort of process. But I think it's also about, in my field, thinking about the sometimes disconnect between scholarship on literature and the way that people read literature and the writing of literature. And that in a lot of ways, what I'm trying to do is think about literature as producing theory and producing the kinds of thinking that we, in the field are sometimes really distinguished as criticism. And so one of the things that is important to me is having good relationships with writers, contemporary writers, and to make sure that I'm, so like when I wrote the book, like every chapter I wrote about someone's book, I sent to them ahead of time and got that sort of feedback and thought about those kind of relationships that I wanted to have with living writers. And that's one of the ways that I think about my own research, is thinking about how we divide criticism in literature, and why we have this like storytelling practice that is so essential and important in certain communities, and then this like level of criticism that comes from mostly the academy that is sort of completely separate from it. And so in my research, I'm trying to really get rid of that, and sort of I'm thinking about my own storytelling practices and things like that. I do this exercise with students sometimes where I ask them, how many of you have had your lives changed at some point by some story you've heard? And everybody says yes. And I think, like, why in radical movements do we not think of storytelling that way all the time then? That it's something that can obviously change people's minds and change people's being and change people's experiences. So in terms of my research process, that's really what I'm interested in, is contemporary books that are coming out from authors who are doing like really interesting formal work. And the who are anarchist thinkers that I'm inspired by is always an interesting question, I think, maybe for all of us, because there is this like critical intervention with anarchism that is so, people always ask me, well, why do you keep doing anarchism then? Like, why are you interested in it still then if you're like so critical of it? But I think there are people that have really inspired me. And I think, like, the first time I picked up this collection, Quiet Rumors, from AK Press, that's an anarcha-feminism's collection. There's a short essay in it from this group Mujeres Creando that's from Bolivia. And they have this great line in it that says, we're not anarchists by the CNT or by Bakunin, we're anarchists by our grandmothers. And I've always thought of that. That has always been really central to the work that I'm doing, to think about what are these histories of anarchism? How are people coming to anarchism? And how do we sort of make room for all of these multiple different stories that maybe don't come from Bakunin or the CNT, but come from people's grandmothers and their relations that they've had with each other. And so that's been really influential to me still as an essay.
Yeah, I would say in terms of my process, I'm just scraping around and grabbing at what I can. I'm not associated with any academic institution. I'm an independent writer and author, so I try to do what I can. I was actually just joking about this with an event I did the other day. I was like, I'm completely undisciplined, so whatever chaos is typically associated with anarchism is actually real within my work. I'm doing the best I can, so it's a place where I am actually trying to draw a line now in terms of my research and in terms of my work and my understanding, whatever I am able to come up with and whatever I'm able to build is again following the example of a lot of those people who came before me, drawing from things that have inspired me and inspired those who came before me, but also having a critical relationship with everything that preceded. So that's one of the reasons why in the book that I'm a person who I try to look at folks who definitely weren't anarchists. I look at someone like CLR James, who was an autonomous Marxist and who has many really pivotal criticisms that are important, in my opinion, very important to Black anarchism, but who was not a Black anarchist. I look at the work of someone like Modibo Kadali, who was a member of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, who also doesn't identify himself as a Black anarchist, but is a mentor and a friend of mine. And just looking at different people, even looking at someone like Lucy Parsons, who was, again, one of the earliest Black anarchists, but the reason her relationship with Black anarchism is sort of fraught because of her complicated relationship to race as a formerly enslaved Black woman, and different things I think she was trying to navigate when you look at her history and her life with regard to race and identity. So I tend to look for these stories and look for these people who are already tracing again and navigating the same path that I feel like I'm on. I'm trying to take these things further and not just parrot or mimic what's already been done or reify what's already established. I'm trying to take this legacy further. And I can also bring up somebody like Russell Maroon Schultz, who I've been talking about a lot, who expressed an affinity for anarchism in his work, and said, "Hey, I'm not an anarchist though." So I think that the important thing for me is again not so much trying to just reify and say everybody do anarchism, everybody be an anarchist. It's more so to look at this history and to look at the work that's been done and to say, what can we come up with that takes all of this further and transcends? And in terms of the people who inspire me, I think I've named them a few times already, but definitely Lorenzo Kambora Urban, Martin Sostre, Lucy Parsons, Kwesi Balagoon, Ashanti Alston, a lot of CLR James, the list goes on and on and on. Janina Urban. These are all people who have shown me how to read and how to write and how to think critically. You know, I made a reading list for this book with AK, and one of the things that I put on that reading list was actually a letter that Pierre-Joseph Proudhon had written to Marx. And Proudhon, for anybody watching who may not know, was the first person to call himself an anarchist. That's where we get the term, right? But Proudhon said in this letter to Marx, he actually warned Marx that if he wasn't careful, that he was going to do the opposite of what he was setting out to do. He was going to establish new dogma. And he said, he told him not to be like his countryman, Martin Luther. And, you know, it's a very shady, spicy letter. But I actually think that it's fascinating. And the reason that I put it on that reading list is because I think that the danger and the risk of actually giving too much exaltation and veneration to the people who influence us and inspire us is that, yes, we can end up recreating a lot of the same problems that we're trying to overcome. So my relationship to everybody that influences me is very similar to what you were talking about, Jorel, and as well, Teresa. Y'all are definitely, I think, thinking very similarly in the way that you have a critical and inspired relationship.
Y'all, thank you so much. I know we're running out of time, but we did start a little bit late. So I am gonna just hit you off with like 2 questions that I'm putting together for from the Q&A. I'm sorry we can't get to every question in here, but I want to kind of expand some of these questions, or expand one of them, and bring this one together with another one. So there's a question that says, has there been or are there intellectual networks of Afro-descendant anarchists across the Americas developing a hemispheric Black anarchism? And I kind of want to extend it to think about Indigenous anarchist movements as well. So are there intellectual networks in the past, in the present, that are developing hemispheric Black and Indigenous anarchism? And then there's been a few questions here about action on the ground, like making actionable politics, actionable change. And one of the questions here is asking, how do we bring these conversations or expand these conversations to non-academics, which I think is a part of the conversation that we're having here anyway, right? And particularly, how do we start to kind of proliferate the intersection of anarchism between Black and Indigenous point of views? And thank you for your insight, it's been great. So these are the kinds of questions. So we have like some about method and particular politics, and some about how do we share this knowledge.
I can jump in. So with regard to Black anarchism, I think one of the things that's pretty interesting about the history of Black anarchism, Lorenzo Kambora Urban, Kwesi Balagoon, Ashanti Alston, Ajori Lutelo, Janina Urban, these are all former Black Panthers, former civil rights movement activists, all former Black Liberation Army members, Black radicals who were very much based in revolutionary movement and struggle. And so in terms of actionable things that people can get from their work, that's all there, because they're coming from a very, although there's a lot of theory, the writing around praxis and around action is very prevalent in the history of Black anarchism. And even if you were going again back to Lucy Parsons writing in the early 1900s, she's one of the founders of the IWW. She was married to one of the men killed in the Haymarket affair, executed afterwards. Very much based in struggle and based in movement. So that is really an essential characteristic of this writing and of this legacy. It is not coming from anywhere close to academia. It's coming from people who were political prisoners, people who were very much hyper surveilled by the state, and people whose lives were on the line, who were facing death sentences, who were facing deportation, who were facing all sorts of various forms of state violence. So that is definitely there. And in terms of that connection to the larger Black struggle throughout the Americas and throughout the African diaspora, it exists as well. And there, especially when you look at the work of someone like Lorenzo Irvin, his legacy and his work is known throughout the world, not just because he's been imprisoned in multiple countries, but because he has spent a lot of time traveling the world, trying to talk to people about anarchism from a Black perspective. So that has created and that has laid the foundations with him and others. And those who also, are based in other countries throughout the Americas and on the continent, on the African continent, bringing their perspectives too. It is definitely there. And I think that that's one of the things that I think I'm trying to do in the future, is actually start trying to connect those struggles and those stories even more so than they already are. So.
Awesome. I guess I'll jump in and say that in terms of the networks of Afro-descendant anarchism, I don't know of any, particularly in the context of the Caribbean and Latin America. I know that there was a federation that was formed about 5-10 years ago in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, of anarchist activists that wanted to be in collaboration. And I know that the Black Rose Federation in the US was there for the foundational meeting of the Caribbean network. But I think that in Latin America, we also need to have a conversation about racial democracy and the way that it permeates even the left, and the way that racial democracy myths articulate certain leftist discourses in which they think that they don't need to talk about race and Blackness. And we need to talk about whiteness and racism in Latin America and also in the context of Latinidad, right? And so I think that because of that, it has curtailed efforts to create a Black-centered anarchist network in the context of the Americas, particularly. And so I think for me, that's important, that conversation, because being an anarchist is not simply advocating the abolition of the state, it's also recognizing where you're fighting from. And so, for example, in Puerto Rico, I think that for me, one of my main priorities is advocating against colonialism, US colonialism, and advocating self-determination of Puerto Rico. And I know, I'm writing a book called Puerto Rico, A National History, right? And, for a lot of anarchists in the US, they're like, yo, what are you doing? You're talking about a nation, you're advocating nation, right? And so, but for me, in the context of Puerto Rico, which is a colonial possession, first of Spain and now of the US, talking about the nation has something to offer anarchism, particularly in the context of Puerto Rico. And also, I really appreciated that comment, William, about, also studying those that are not anarchists as part of this broader anarchist tradition or anarchic tradition. Because in Puerto Rico, the people that have advanced the struggle have been the nationalists. From Albizu Campo all the way to the nationalists in the 70s who blew up fighter planes in, the Muniz Air Base. And that's important. So in terms of proliferation, I think that's a very important question for me. You know, I'm speaking from within academia. I was not born in an academic family. I'm, you know, the first gen. I didn't even know what I was doing as I was going through the portals of academia. So for me, it's really important for my work to circulate beyond. That's why that book was published in Spanish, and it's free also in PDF, because for me, it's important for it to circulate in Puerto Rico. I know that book doesn't carry academic capital. It will not grant me tenure. It was additional work that I needed to do, but it was important work for me. And more so because I know that there are anarchists, I cannot believe that there's a younger generation now. I feel so ancient, but there's a younger generation that's organizing, that's occupying spaces, that, you know, there's a graffiti crew called GGK. If anyone's interested, follow them on Instagram. They're doing amazing work, spray painting walls across Puerto Rico. And so I wanted these texts to be available to those folks, right? And I'm also open to, you know, there's a saying in Spanish, si saben cómo me pongo, pa' qué me invitan? If you know how I end up, why are you inviting me? So please invite me. I would love to also be in conversation and share these histories beyond the ivory tower. And the last thing I'll say is that in 2011, I was at this anarchist conference in Toronto, and I was talking to this Oaxacan anarchist. And he had been part of the struggles of the teacher struggle. I think it was 2008, 2006. You know, he was very militant. And he was like, yo, we don't need teachers in the revolution, he told me. Because he was like, oh, you're an academic. We don't need teachers. We need people that know how to shoot a gun. And I was like, yo, I respect that. But also, and he was telling me how he was given a gun because they were shooting from a helicopter in the strikes. And so he was like, you either shot or you were dead. So you needed to survive. I was like, yo, I respect that. But I think that we all have our trenches, right? And so I think that's important to continue the work wherever you're at. And so I don't know if I'm saying that just because I'm within academia, and, you know, it's this myth of I'm transforming it from within, let's decolonize academia. That's impossible. That's not, but at the same time, I think there's, you know, we need to fight within the trenches that we have. And so I'll leave it there. I'm more than happy to talk beyond academia. If anyone in Puerto Rico or elsewhere wants to invite me, let's go.
Yeah, I guess that means it's my turn. Can you hear me? Sorry, my internet is, speaking of academia, I'm on my campus of my university and the internet keeps going out. So that's what the kind of support that they have for in general. But, you know, I'm just thinking about like connections, hemispheric connections or global connections. I think there's been a lot of connections of Indigenous people across the world. It's been a big part of a lot of Indigenous movements, thinking about specifically like in a lot of anarchist texts, they talk about the Zapatistas, obviously is a big example. But I think that there's a lot of strong connections that we can look at. They aren't, and I so appreciate William and Jorel bringing up like people who aren't anarchists, because a lot of the people that I talk about in my work are not anarchists, but their work, that doesn't mean their work can't be useful to thinking about anti-state and anti-capitalist movements. So yeah, I'm really interested in that and interested in how to build coalition with people. And I think this might sound kind of simple, but it really comes down to care. And I think I, you know, spend a lot of time with folks on the ground just saying like, how do we care about each other and how do we make sure that we feel cared for? And I think it can sound really simple, but it's very difficult actually. And especially in the past couple of years, it's been really important.
I think we got frozen. Okay, you're unfrozen, Teresa. Go ahead.
I'm done. My connection is unstable, and as am I. But I just want to end on that note of care. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I just want to thank you all and thank all the participants for being here. This conversation has been even more incredible than I imagined. There's so many layers. I feel like we can actually sit back and kick it and talk for like 2 or 3 more hours on this. I just want to thank you once again, William, Jorel, Teresa, for being here, for sharing all of your work, your knowledge, your politics, your care, your love with us, your love for Black and Indigenous and Puerto Rican people, broadly speaking, and for making us think about solidarities in new and exciting ways. And definitely I'm going to be sitting with the question of good relations. What does that mean for us to have good relations, not just with one another, but across a series of different positionalities. On behalf of Electric Marronage, we are so grateful. I wanted to share with you another event that we're going to be having on April 1st. It's going to be reflections on 2 books, Toward Camden and Magical Habits, featuring the authors Mercy Romero and Monica Huerta. This event is going to kind of think about the intimate politics of writing, particularly from Chicana, like Midwestern perspectives, and Puerto Ricans in New Jersey. So thinking about Camden, thinking about geography, displacement, thinking about overlapping forms of movement and migration. And so that is going to be on April 1st at 3 p.m. And then the link is down there, tinyurl.com / I can't remember the word, EM Magical Camden. But beyond that, I just want to thank you all for being here and for this conversation. You are so appreciated. And we are recording this, and we will be sharing it on the Electric Marronage site for a limited time only. So we'll send out the information for that. So if you missed a part of it, make sure you catch up there. Thank you so much and have a beautiful day.